All right, we are on day 3 with acrylic paint. We're going to be going back to using the palettes from the first day. I just randomly picked this palette and I want to point out a couple things. I can see that it hasn't stayed that clean, particularly the white paint. Someone got some red paint in there and I put some new white paint and I do see a little more red in here. So we do want to try really hard to keep that paint really clean. If it's a light color like white or yellow, like what I would do here if I really need a clean white is just scoop out that little part. As for the black, which has a lot of yellow paint, the nice thing about that is that black is a really strong paint. And if it's just a little bit, you can sort of mix it in and everything will just turn black. All right, now we're going to be doing a few different techniques, 4 different techniques today. Wet on dry, it's the same thing that we did with the watercolor paint. I want you to try to do it with the acrylic paint. Gradient and blending, which means we're going to try to go from one color to the next using blending. And then a wash. I'll show you how to make a wash. Here it says splatter. You can choose to splatter in either area. You don't have a lot of control with splatter, so it'll probably go in both areas here, and I'll show you that last. All right, let's start with the wet on dry. Just like last time with the watercolor paints, we're just going to be filling in an area. I'm picking blue again, and we're gonna let it dry and paint on top of it. This is also called layering. You're layering paint. So when you're doing a background, for example, a lot of times when you think about an acrylic painting, you got to get your background in first and then you're going to paint on top of it, but you got to let it dry. Acrylic paint, the nice thing about acrylic paint is that it dries super fast, so it'll definitely be dry by the time we go back to it at the end. All right. Gradient and blending. So if you want to blend from one color to the next, you're doing a gradient. There's a few ways to do it. I like to pick colors that are close together on the color wheel. So for example, red to orange would be a nice example, except you only have the primary colors here. So I'm actually going to pick red and yellow, and we'll see that hopefully, if we do it correctly, the orange will be mixed in the middle. Now I'm starting by just adding some red paint on one side. I'm going to clean my brush. I'm using my paper towel to dry it. Your goal is that you're not mixing the colors in the palette here, this original palette, so we want to avoid getting ruining our colors here on the palette. Okay, now I'm mixing yellow. Now I'm going to start, adding yellow. I'm going to start bringing that yellow out, and then I'm going to do the same with the red. You got to do this while the paint is still wet. Doesn't work with dry paint. Now once I kind of get to the middle, I do a little bit of blending. And the goal is that it goes from red to slowly yellow. Now yellow's a lighter color and it's not as strong as the red. So if you want to keep that yellow on the end there, you might, sometimes I'll just kind of clean my brush off and dry it. And when you get towards the lighter color, you want to be kind of careful not to overdo it with the darker color. Okay. I'm just brushing back and forth. All right, and that looks pretty good. You can also move some of that yellow over. Okay. If you feel like, oh no, not enough yellow here, go ahead and add a little more. Try to keep a clean brush. Okay. Now for the wash. Oh, I meant to say try to keep a clean palette as you're dipping back and forth. Sometimes it's easy to forget. Okay, now for the wash. A wash is acrylic paint that you add water to. I mean, you can really make a wash with any kind of paint, but for this one, we're talking about acrylic paint. So, one way to do it, if you need a big wash, is to use a tray. For today, if you have an empty spot in your palette, I would just use that. So I'm going to take my blue, move it over into a little empty well here, and now I'm just going to take drips of water. If you have a bigger brush, you can do it that way and add a little more. And in fact, it would be great for you to use a bigger brush. Oh, I found some red paint in here, so I'm just gonna mix a purple for the wash. Okay. All right. So I would say a good ratio with the wash is about 50% water, 50% paint. All right, I'm gonna try to paint it on, and the goal is that it's pretty transparent. Okay. Now in this scenario, just like with watercolors, you can do a little bit of blotting with a clean paper towel, and you can pull some of that color up because we've sort of made a watercolor with our acrylic paint. Should be nice and transparent. These are great for when you're painting water and you want it to be a little bit transparent. All right, so I'm gonna move on to wet on dry, do a little painting on top of the dry paint here, and then the splatter. Okay, so wet on dry, I'm just gonna do a little night scene. I can tell that the paint isn't totally dry everywhere, but for the sake of time, I would love to see you guys just do a little painting on top. You don't have to use the same color, but you can see I am for the sake of time. Okay. So now we've got our wet on dry, and then the splatter paint. Now, for splatter paint, you need to make a wash. And it's best to use, if you're gonna do white paint to splatter, it's best to use very clean water. By this time, your water might not be clean. I'm looking at my water and it is not clean. I'm also getting red paint into my white, which is also not good. Okay, so I've got my white paint here. My water's pretty dirty, but I'm gonna go for it anyways, just because we need to move on. Okay. So the point of this is that you're trying to make the paint kind of watery so it splatters better. Now, if you want to do this in class, you have to ask me, and you can do it outside if you want to do this during studio time. For today, I just want you to be really controlled with it, and I just want you to practice a little area. Let's not shoot paint all over our friends. Okay, so you take your brush once it has the watery paint in it, and you just do a little flick, and you can get your splatter. Do not do more than 3. We don't need to splatter our whole thing. I just want to show you how to do it so you can practice. All right, now, time for you guys to get started.